30 battle companions died in the darkness before any could raise weapon or voice in alarm. The creature's claws tore through mail and flesh with equal ease. His jaws crushed skulls and snapped spines. Most terrifying of all, no sword or spear could penetrate his hide. Some evil enchantment rendered him immune to the weapons with which men had always defended themselves. When dawn broke over the blood-soaked timber palace, King Hrothgar found his greatest champions reduced to mangled corpses, their blades scattered uselessly around their torn bodies. This was Grendel's first assault on Heorot, but it would not be his last. The great mead house had stood as the crown jewel of the northern world, a structure so magnificent that its fame spread to every corner of the warrior kingdoms. Built by the Danish king as the ultimate expression of his reign's achievements, Heorot rose from the landscape like a man-made mountain, its golden roof visible for miles across the windswept plains. Within its vast walls, hundreds of thanes could feast together, bound by the sacred oaths that held their world together, the unbreakable ties between lord and retainer, the fierce loyalty of shield brothers, the generous dispensing of treasure that made such loyalty possible. For this was the world of the northern peoples, Geats, Danes, Swedes, and Frisians, who measured worth not in gold alone, but in the courage to face death with honor. Their society rested upon bonds stronger than iron, the relationship between generous lord and faithful follower, the terrible burden of word that no man could escape but which the brave could meet with dignity. These were not settled farmers or peaceful merchants, but fighter bands who followed their leaders into the storm of battle, knowing that death might claim them before sunset, yet finding in that very uncertainty the essence of heroic life. The mead house embodied everything that separated civilization from the wild darkness beyond. When winter storms lashed the land with killing cold, when raiders emerged from sea fog or forest shadow, the feast house provided sanctuary. Its blazing hearth drove back both cold and fear, while its strong walls sheltered the fellowship that made life worth living. Here champions gathered to hear the songs of bards who preserved heroic deeds in memory, to receive rewards from generous rulers, and to swear the oaths that bound them in brotherhood stronger than blood. Within torch-lit Heorot, chaos yielded to order. The random violence of the outside world gave way to ceremony, hierarchy, and law. A good lord dispensed treasure to loyal followers, ensuring their devotion through generosity. Sword-bearers offered their blades and their lives in exchange for protection, sustenance, and a share in whatever glory their deeds might win. Here men found their place in the cosmic order, no longer isolated individuals facing an indifferent universe, but members of a community with shared values and mutual obligations. Yet there are forces in the world that cannot bear the sight of mortal happiness, creatures whose existence depends upon spreading misery and fear. The sound of celebration in Heorot, the music and laughter, the songs praising the Creator who had blessed mankind with such gifts, reached ears that had never known anything but hatred. In the dark fenlands beyond the borders of civilized settlement, where mist clung to stagnant pools and no healthy thing could grow, dwelt one whose genealogy traced back to the first murderer. Grendel, descended from the line of Cain, who had shed his brother's blood and been cast out from the community of men, embodied everything that opposed earthly civilization. Where people sought fellowship, he knew only isolation. Where they created beauty, he could only destroy. Where they built feast houses to celebrate life, he brought death. The creature's torment went deeper than mere physical existence in the wasteland. Each night, the sounds of joy from the golden roof penetrated his dwelling, like knives twisting in an unhealing wound. The music of the bards, especially their songs praising the Almighty, who had created the world and blessed humanity with the capacity for love and loyalty, filled him with rage beyond endurance. Here was everything he could never possess: the warm companionship of the Timber Palace, the pride of thanes in their achievements, the hope that sustains mortal striving. That first night of slaughter had come without warning. The retainers, heavy with mead and exhausted by celebration, had fallen asleep in the great structure rather than returning to their separate dwellings. Grendel moved through the darkness like a shadow given malevolent life, approaching the massive doors that no earthly force should have been able to breach. Yet whatever dark powers he served granted him strength beyond natural limits. The iron hinges groaned and snapped. The oak beams splintered like kindling. The discovery that conventional warfare could not touch this enemy transformed the Danish kingdom's confident strength into helpless despair. The grey-bearded king gathered his wisest counselors and bravest remaining fighters. But what strategy could prevail against a foe immune to weapons? The ring-giver consulted ancient texts and sought advice from neighboring rulers. But no precedent existed for such a catastrophe. Desperate prayers rose to the gods of their fathers, yet the powers that had blessed their ancestors seemed silent in the face of this unprecedented evil. Most terrifying was the monster's calculated malevolence. Grendel did not simply kill, he delighted in defiling everything sacred to mortal civilization. He scattered the carved decorations that celebrated heroic deeds, befouled the high seat where the sovereign dispensed justice and treasure, left the golden roof beams stained with innocent blood. The creature seemed to understand exactly what would cause the deepest psychological wounds, targeting not just bodies, but the very symbols that gave meaning to warrior life. Night after night, the attacks continued. The great building that had been the symbol of Danish glory became a charnel house where no champion dared remain after sunset. Shield-bearers who had faced charging boars and enemy battle lines without flinching found their courage drained by an enemy they could neither understand nor effectively resist. The bonds of loyalty that had held the kingdom together began to fray as men questioned what duty they owed to a lord who could not protect them from supernatural malevolence. Years passed in this manner, 12 long years in which the glory of the Danes withered like flowers before an early frost. The monarch could not abandon Heorot entirely, for to do so would mean the final victory of chaos over order. Each day he held court in the mead house, conducting the business of kingship as if nothing had changed. But when evening approached and shadows lengthened across the blood-stained floor, the ruler and his remaining followers retreated to smaller buildings, leaving the great space empty for the monster's nightly visitation. A generation of young sword-bearers grew to manhood, knowing only defeat and humiliation. The reputation that had once drawn heroes from distant lands to seek service in the royal court became instead a warning that kept the wise and brave away from Danish shores. The treasure hoard that should have been distributed to loyal followers accumulated unused in locked chambers. For what good were golden arm rings to men who might not live to see another dawn? The psychological devastation cut deeper than the physical slaughter. Individual courage, the virtue most prized in their fighter culture, had become meaningless against an enemy immune to conventional weapons. What did it matter if a man's heart held no fear when his sword could not bite? How could honor be maintained when the foe could not be fought on equal terms? The very foundations of their worldview, that brave men could face any challenge, that loyalty and courage would ultimately triumph over evil, crumbled beneath the weight of nightly horror. The older thanes, those who remembered the Timber Palace's golden inauguration, felt the weight of their failure most keenly. They had sworn oaths to defend their lord with their lives, yet against this enemy, their willingness to die meant nothing if their deaths could accomplish nothing. Some spoke of seeking honorable death in foreign wars, rather than enduring the daily reminder of their powerlessness. Others turned to the old gods with increasing desperation, offering sacrifices that their Christian beliefs should have forbidden, hoping that some ancient power might prove more effective than prayer to the God of mercy and love. The fame of Denmark's catastrophe spread across the northern kingdoms like ripples from a stone cast into still water. Bards carried tales of the monster that could not be killed, the great mead house left empty each night, the mighty king reduced to helpless despair. Some listeners dismissed these accounts as exaggeration or allegory. Others recognized in the stories a challenge that might test the limits of heroic possibility. In the land of the Geats, across the grey waters where different bloodlines preserved different traditions of heroism, word of Grendel's war against civilization reached the ears of a young thane whose strength exceeded that of 30 ordinary men. This champion had already proven himself in swimming contests that lasted for days, had fought sea monsters in the icy depths, had demonstrated the kind of supernatural prowess that marked him as chosen by fate for extraordinary deeds. When the terrible news from Denmark reached his ears, Beowulf, son of Ecgtheow, felt the stirring of something deeper than mere ambition. Here was a challenge worthy of his gifts, an enemy that had defeated an entire kingdom, a chance to win the kind of glory that would echo through the centuries. The monster's immunity to weapons did not daunt him. Indeed, it suggested that this battle would require exactly the kind of strength that set him apart from ordinary fighters. The young hero began to plan his voyage across the Whale Road, gathering a band of the finest Geatish champions willing to follow him into what might well prove their final adventure. Word spread through the royal court that Beowulf intended to seek out this creature that had brought the mighty Danes to their knees. Some called it madness, to challenge a foe that had defeated hundreds of experienced thanes. Others recognized it as the ultimate test of heroic virtue. The darkness over Heorot was about to meet its match. The news of Grendel's reign of terror reached the court of Hygelac, king of the Geats, through the voices of seafaring merchants and wandering bards that carried tales across the northern kingdoms like seeds borne on the wind. Among those listening to these accounts with burning interest was Ecgtheow's son, nephew to the throne, and bearer of a reputation that had already spread far beyond his homeland's borders. This young champion possessed strength that defied natural explanation, the power of 30 men concentrated in a single frame, yet wielded with the precision and intelligence separating true heroes from mere brutes. His exploits had become legend even in youth. The swimming contest with Breca, lasting 7 days and nights through storm-tossed seas, during which he had slain 9 sea monsters with his bare hands while protecting his companion from the creatures of the deep. Those witnessing his feats spoke of otherworldly endurance, of a warrior chosen by fate itself for deeds beyond ordinary mortal capability. Yet the young hero's lineage carried both blessing and burden. His father Ecgtheow had once been embroiled in a bitter feud, threatening to consume entire tribes in cycles of vengeance. Only through King Hrothgar's intervention, the Danish ruler's payment of Wergild to settle the blood debt, had peace been restored and Ecgtheow's son been granted the chance to grow to manhood without the shadow of inherited violence hanging over his head. This debt of honor weighed heavily on his mind as he contemplated the reports from Denmark. The concept of Wergild, blood price paid to prevent endless feuding, formed one of the fundamental pillars supporting their warrior society. When violence erupted between kinship groups, as it inevitably did in a world where honor meant everything and insult could not be borne, the ancient laws provided a path away from mutual destruction. Gold could replace blood, payment could substitute for vengeance, and communities could heal rather than tear themselves apart in perpetual warfare. But this system created networks of obligation, stretching across generations and kingdoms, binding men to honor debts contracted by their fathers and grandfathers. Hrothgar's generosity toward Ecgtheow represented more than mere diplomacy. It had forged a bond between the Danish and northern royal houses, transcending immediate political advantage. The ring-giver had spent precious treasure to preserve peace, had chosen costly magnanimity over the cheaper satisfactions of letting enemies destroy each other. Such wisdom and generosity created obligations that could not be forgotten by men of honor, debts passing from father to son as surely as land or weapons. As the champion listened to the merchant's tales of Grendel's immunity to weapons, of brave thanes reduced to torn flesh and splintered bone, of a mighty kingdom brought to its knees by a creature mocking every principle of heroic combat, he felt the stirring of something deeper than mere ambition. Here was an opportunity to repay his father's debt, while simultaneously achieving the kind of glory ensuring his name echoed through the centuries. The monster's preternatural nature did not daunt him. Indeed, it suggested that this battle would require exactly the kind of strength setting him apart from ordinary fighters. More than personal glory or inherited obligation drove his decision. The young warrior understood that Grendel's war represented an assault on the fundamental values holding their civilization together. The creature's targeting of Heorot struck at the very heart of what made life worth living: the fellowship of the mead house, the bonds between lord and retainer, the sacred space where chaos yielded to order and darkness to light. If such evil could triumph in Denmark, it might spread to threaten every kingdom in the northern world. His extraordinary strength had never been tested against truly mystical opposition. Swimming contests and sea monsters, impressive as they were, remained within the realm of exceptional but natural achievement. Grendel represented something entirely different, a creature violating the normal laws governing mortal combat. The challenge excited rather than intimidated him, for what glory could match that of defeating an enemy proven invincible to an entire kingdom's finest champions? When the hero announced his intention to seek out this monster that had brought the mighty Danes to their knees, reactions varied throughout the royal court. Some called it madness to challenge a foe that had defeated hundreds of experienced warriors. Others questioned whether it was wise to risk their finest thane on what might prove a futile gesture. The older retainers, veterans of countless battles, having seen young heroes consumed by reckless ambition, cautioned against underestimating an enemy confounding conventional wisdom so completely. But King Hygelac, though troubled by the prospect of losing his nephew and most valued champion, recognized both the obligation and the opportunity that Grendel's terror presented. The debt to Hrothgar could not be ignored without dishonoring the entire royal line. Moreover, if his nephew succeeded where all others had failed, the glory would reflect upon the entire kingdom, strengthening alliances and enhancing the reputation, bringing tribute from distant lands, and attracting the finest warriors to their service. The selection of companions for such an expedition required careful consideration. 14 of the most experienced fighters from Geatland volunteered to accompany their champion across the Whale Road, men proving their courage in numerous battles and bearing loyalty to the young hero transcending mere duty. These were not untested youths seeking easy glory, but mature warriors understanding the magnitude of the challenge they faced and choosing to embrace it anyway. Among them stood champions, remembered alongside their leader's name, seasoned veterans having fought beside him in previous campaigns, younger nobles eager to prove themselves worthy of their bloodlines, and skilled seamen possessing knowledge of the treacherous northern waters, essential for the success of their voyage. Each man understood that they might be sailing toward their deaths, yet each chose honor over safety, glory over comfortable obscurity. The preparation of their vessel became a ritual, drawing the attention of the entire kingdom. The ship selected for this momentous journey was no ordinary craft, but a magnificent war vessel, requiring the finest materials and most skilled craftsmen available. Her hull had been shaped from oak trees, growing for centuries in sacred groves. Her iron fittings forged by master smiths, understanding the mystical properties, protecting seafarers from the creatures of the deep. The prow bore intricate carvings, honoring the gods of wind and wave, while her sides displayed the painted shields of the champions sailing aboard her. Gold and silver decorated her steering oar and the high seat where their leader would command the expedition. When fully loaded with weapons, armor, and provisions for the journey, she rode the waters like a floating fortress, her presence commanding respect from all witnessing her departure. The ritual loading of treasure for Hrothgar revealed another crucial aspect of their mission. Diplomatic protocol demanded that visitors to a foreign court arrive bearing gifts appropriate to their status and the importance of their business. The champion selected precious objects demonstrating both his personal wealth and the prosperity of his homeland. Intricately wrought golden ornaments, weapons of exceptional craftsmanship, rare furs from northern hunting expeditions, and other treasures honoring the Danish king, while establishing the visitors' credentials as men of substance rather than desperate adventurers. The weapons chosen for this expedition reflected both practical necessity and symbolic meaning. Each warrior selected his finest blade, spear, and shield, equipment blessed by priests, tested in battle, and imbued with the spiritual power coming from victorious combat. The hero's own sword, inherited from his father and bearing the accumulated luck of previous triumphs, would serve him well if conventional weapons proved effective against their unearthly enemy. Yet he prepared himself mentally for the possibility that this battle might require strength alone, without the aid of mortal steel. The morning of departure dawned clear and cold, with favorable winds seeming to promise divine approval for their enterprise. The entire court gathered at the harbor to witness the ceremony, launching their champions toward either immortal glory or noble death. King Hygelac spoke words of blessing and encouragement, while the court bards sang ancient songs, recalling the deeds of legendary heroes facing similar challenges in ages past. The young warrior's farewell speech to his people revealed the depth of thought behind his seemingly impulsive decision. He spoke of duty to allies, of the obligations created by past kindnesses, of the responsibility that extraordinary strength placed upon those possessing it. He acknowledged the possibility of failure and death, but argued that such risks were the price of living a life worthy of remembrance. Better to die in glorious attempt than to live safely while evil triumphed unopposed. The voyage across the Whale Road tested both seamanship and courage in ways that land-based warriors rarely experienced. The North Sea in that season could shift from deceptive calm to lethal fury within moments, and the path to Denmark led through waters known to harbour creatures existing at the boundaries between myth and reality. Yet the favourable winds blessing their departure continued throughout the journey, driving their vessel toward its destination with speed seeming almost divine. As the Danish coastline appeared through the morning mist, the champion and his companions prepared themselves for the crucial first encounters. determining whether their mission proceeded toward glorious combat or ended in diplomatic failure. The sight of their warship approaching Danish waters would certainly attract the attention of coastal guards having the duty to challenge all foreign vessels, regardless of their apparent peaceful intentions. The Danish coast guard intercepting their landing proved to be a veteran warrior, trained to evaluate both the threat level and the status of unexpected visitors with practiced skill. His initial challenge carried the authority of royal command, yet his manner suggested recognition that these arrivals might represent opportunity rather than danger. The quality of their ship, the richness of their equipment, and the obvious martial bearing of the 15 warriors clearly marked them as men of importance, rather than common raiders or desperate refugees. Ecgtheow's son's response to this challenge would set the tone for everything that followed. He identified himself and his companions clearly, stated their purpose without boastfulness or false modesty, and demonstrated the kind of courtesy marking him as a man worthy of royal attention. His explanation of their mission, to offer assistance against the monster plaguing Denmark for 12 years, struck exactly the right balance between confidence in his own abilities and respect for the magnitude of the challenge he proposed to undertake. The Coast Guard's reaction revealed both professional competence and personal honor. Rather than simply granting passage or demanding more detailed explanations, he chose to escort these distinguished visitors personally toward Hrothgar's court, ensuring that they received treatment appropriate to their status while protecting them from any misunderstandings that might arise from their foreign appearance. His decision to abandon his coastal post in order to guide them demonstrated his recognition that their mission might represent the answer to Denmark's desperate prayers. The journey inland toward the royal court provided the champion and his companions with their first direct view of how 12 years of mystical terror had affected the Danish kingdom. The countryside showed signs of prosperity and careful cultivation, evidence of the golden age that Hrothgar's wise rule had created. Yet subtle indicators revealed the strain that constant fear had placed upon the population. Settlements stood closer together than might otherwise be necessary, as if mutual protection had become more important than agricultural efficiency. The people they encountered showed the wariness of those learning to expect catastrophe, even in moments of apparent peace. The great timber palace itself appeared before them like a vision from the golden age of heroes, its massive walls and soaring roof beams testimony to the architectural ambition and abundant resources making its construction possible. Yet even in daylight, with the sun gleaming off its golden decorations and banners flying proudly from its highest points, something in its appearance suggested the shadow falling across it each night, the very magnificence making it a target for preternatural malevolence continued to mark it as the stage where the coming battle between heroism and evil would reach its climax. The moment had arrived for the young hero to present himself before Hrothgar and formally request the opportunity to attempt what no Danish champion had been able to accomplish. The success or failure of this diplomatic encounter would determine whether the warrior would have the chance to test his strength against the creature bringing a mighty kingdom to its knees. The great doors of Heorot swung open before the Geatish fighters like the gates of legend itself. Within the torch-lit expanse of the famous mead house, the surviving thanes gathered around their king in a scene that spoke both of past glory and present desperation. The golden decorations still gleamed from the high rafters. The carved pillars still displayed the heroic deeds of bygone ages. Yet something in the atmosphere suggested a court living under perpetual shadow. King Hrothgar rose from his throne as the 15 foreign fighters entered his presence, and the years seemed to fall away from his shoulders. Here at last stood men who had come not to flee his cursed realm, but to offer aid in its darkest hour. The grey-bearded sovereign's eyes fixed upon the leader of this band, a young defender bearing himself with the quiet confidence that marked those born to extraordinary deeds. Ecgtheow's son stepped forward and delivered the formal speech that protocol demanded. Yet his words carried a sincerity that transcended mere diplomatic courtesy. He identified himself clearly, spoke of his father's debt to Hrothgar's generosity, and offered his strength against the monster that had brought terror to this ancient kingdom. Most importantly, he requested the honor of facing the demon alone, without the aid of weapons, trusting to the strength of his hands and the favor of the Almighty. This last declaration sent murmurs of astonishment through the assembled Danes. Thanes who had watched their finest swordsmen fall before the beast's otherworldly malevolence struggled to comprehend such audacity. Some interpreted the young Gate's words as the boastfulness of inexperience, the kind of reckless bravado that led promising fighters to early graves. Others recognized something deeper, the calm certainty of a man who understood exactly what he proposed to attempt, and had already accepted whatever consequences might follow. Hrothgar's response revealed both the desperate hope of a ruler who had exhausted all other possibilities, and the genuine wisdom that had made his reign legendary. He welcomed the foreign defender with words that acknowledged both the magnitude of the offer and the terrible reality of what had befallen his kingdom. The ring-giver spoke of the 12 years of horror, of the brave men who had died attempting what this young fighter now proposed, of the prayers that had seemed to go unanswered until this moment. Yet even as hope stirred in the royal court, skepticism found its voice through Unferth, son of Ecglaf, a thane sitting near the king's feet. This swordsman, skilled in word combat and jealous of his reputation as the finest man-at-arms in Hrothgar's service, could not bear to see his own status diminished by the arrival of a foreign champion. Rising from his place, Unferth launched into a calculated challenge designed to expose what he believed to be empty boasting. The court thane's attack focused on the famous swimming contest between the young Geat and Breca, son of Beanstan. Unferth's version of events painted Ecgtheow's son as a reckless fool who had risked his life and his companion's life for the sake of vainglory, ultimately losing the contest through pride and poor judgment. The implication was clear. If this defender could not even defeat a mortal opponent in simple swimming, what hope did he have against a fiend that had proven invincible to the kingdom's finest fighters? The challenge served multiple purposes beyond mere verbal sparring. In their society, the ability to defend one's reputation through word combat was considered as important as skill with sword and spear. A leader who could not answer such attacks convincingly would lose the respect necessary to command men in battle. Unferth's assault tested not only the foreign champion's truthfulness, but also his wisdom, his self-control, and his understanding of the political dynamics that governed courtly life. The young man's response demonstrated exactly the kind of mature leadership that marked him as more than a mere fighting machine. Rather than responding with anger or indignation, he corrected Unferth's account with calm authority, revealing the true nature of his contest with Breca. The swimming match had indeed lasted 7 days and nights, but far from being a foolish display of pride, it had become a life-or-death struggle against the monsters of the deep. During that ordeal in the storm-tossed waters, 9 sea beasts had attacked the swimmers, drawn by the scent of mortal blood and the promise of easy prey. While Breca had managed to reach shore safely, Ecgtheow's son had been forced to fight these demons with nothing but his bare hands and a small knife. One by one, he had destroyed the monsters, sending their corpses to the ocean floor, while protecting not only himself, but also ensuring that these terrors could never again threaten innocent seafarers. The detailed account of this battle revealed several crucial aspects of the Geat's character and capabilities. His strength clearly transcended normal mortal limitations. No ordinary man could have survived such an encounter, much less emerged victorious. His courage extended beyond mere physical bravery to encompass moral responsibility, as evidenced by his willingness to face additional danger in order to protect others. Most importantly, his victory over beings that existed at the boundaries between natural and mystical reality suggested that he might indeed possess the extraordinary power necessary to challenge the terror successfully. The young fighter's conclusion carried a pointed rebuke to his challenger. He observed that neither Unferth nor any other court thane had been able to protect their own people from the monster's attacks, despite having the advantage of familiar territory and the support of their fellow soldiers. The implication was unmistakable. Those who had failed to defend their own hall had little standing to question the credentials of one offering to attempt what they could not accomplish. This exchange accomplished far more than settling a question of personal reputation. It established the foreign defender's intellectual and rhetorical capabilities alongside his physical prowess, demonstrating that he possessed the complete range of skills necessary for heroic leadership. It also served notice to potential rivals that he would not be intimidated or manipulated by those seeking to protect their own positions at the expense of their people's welfare. King Hrothgar's intervention brought the verbal contest to a close, while clearly indicating his judgment of the matter. The wise sovereign praised the young man's words and welcomed him as a guest worthy of the highest honors. More significantly, he formally granted permission for the attempt against the fiend, transferring temporary authority over Heorot itself to the foreign leader. This represented an extraordinary gesture of trust, effectively placing the symbol of royal power under the protection of an outsider. The remainder of that day passed in preparation and celebration. The Geatish fighters received the kind of hospitality befitting their status as honored guests, while their commander consulted with advisors about the beast's habits and the layout of the great timber palace. The practical details of the coming confrontation required careful planning. Which areas of the mead house offered the best tactical advantages? How to ensure that his companions would be positioned to assist if necessary? What arrangements needed to be made for the aftermath of the battle, whether it resulted in victory or defeat? As evening approached and the time for the court's withdrawal drew near, Queen Wealhtheow made her appearance in the great hall. The royal consort's presence added solemnity to the occasion, while providing an opportunity for the formal ceremonies that would seal the bond between the visiting fighters and their hosts. Moving with the grace and dignity befitting her station, she offered the ceremonial mead cup first to her husband, then to the foreign champion, and finally to his companions. This ritual carried profound symbolic meaning within their culture. By accepting the cup from the queen's hands, Ecgtheow's son formally acknowledged his temporary role as defender of the royal house. The mead itself, blessed by the queen's touch and offered in the sacred space of the great hall, carried the accumulated luck and spiritual power of the kingdom. Drinking it bound the foreign soldiers to their hosts through ties that transcended mere political alliance. Wealhtheow's words to the young defender revealed both her desperate hope and her clear understanding of the stakes involved in the coming battle. She spoke of her son's future, of the legacy that would pass to them if the realm could be freed from the shadow of otherworldly terror. Her plea carried the weight of maternal love, combined with royal responsibility, adding a personal dimension to what might otherwise have been seen as merely a political or military challenge. As the court prepared to withdraw for the night, Leaving Heorot to the foreign fighters, Hrothgar delivered a final speech that summarized both his hopes and his fears. He spoke of the many brave thanes who had attempted to guard the mead house against the monster's attacks, all of whom had died horribly, despite their courage and skill. He acknowledged that he was asking these strangers to risk their lives for a people not their own, in a battle that had already claimed more swordsmen than any other conflict in living memory. Yet the ring-giver also expressed his growing conviction that divine providence had brought these particular men to Denmark at this crucial moment. The young leader's extraordinary strength, combined with his obvious wisdom and moral authority, suggested that fate itself had chosen him as the instrument through which the terror's reign would finally end. The king's blessing carried both the weight of royal authority and the fervent prayer of a man who had seen his greatest achievements reduced to ashes by forces beyond his control. The withdrawal of the court left 15 Geatish soldiers alone in the vast expanse of Heorot, as darkness settled over the kingdom. The great mead house, which had once echoed with the laughter and songs of hundreds of celebrants, now stood empty, save for these foreign fighters who had volunteered to face what no one else had been able to defeat. The silence seemed to press against them like a living thing, heavy with the accumulated fear and sorrow of 12 years of nightly horror. Tsigthiau's son made his final preparations with the calm deliberation of a man who had already accepted whatever fate awaited him. He removed his armor and set aside his weapons, choosing to meet the demon on equal terms, without the advantages that conventional warfare might provide. This decision reflected not only his confidence in his own strength, but also his understanding that the beast's immunity to mortal weapons made such equipment useless anyway. The Geat's companions arranged themselves throughout the hall, according to the plan they had developed during the day's consultations. While their leader would face the fiend alone, they stood ready to provide whatever assistance might prove possible. Each man understood that their swords and spears might prove as ineffective as every blade in the kingdom had been, yet each remained determined to share in whatever glory or doom the night would bring. As the hours passed and midnight approached, the atmosphere in Heorot grew increasingly tense. Outside the great doors, the normal sounds of night gradually faded into an unnatural silence that seemed to herald the approach of something that did not belong to the world of mortal beings. The very air seemed to thicken with malevolent anticipation, as if the darkness itself had become aware of the challenge that awaited its champion. The first sign of the terror's approach came not through sight or sound, but through a feeling of wrongness that penetrated to the bone. The temperature in the great hall seemed to drop suddenly, while shadows gathered in corners where no shadows should have been able to form. The carefully banked fires flickered despite the absence of any wind, and the golden decorations that had gleamed so brightly during the day now seemed dulled and tarnished. Then came the sound that had haunted nightmares for 12 years. The groaning of massive timbers under impossible strain, the shriek of iron hinges pushed beyond their limits, the crash of the great doors being torn from their mountings, as if they were made of parchment rather than oak and bronze. The destroyer had arrived to claim his nightly tribute of mortal flesh and despair. The fiend that entered Heorot defied every expectation of what a living being should look like. Larger than any man, yet moving with fluid grace that spoke of intelligence rather than mere animal cunning, the demon bore the stamp of otherworldly malevolence in every line of his form. His hide, which no weapon had ever been able to penetrate, gleamed like dark metal in the flickering firelight. His claws, capable of tearing through mail and bone with equal ease, caught the light like polished obsidian. Most terrifying of all were the monster's eyes, which burned with hatred so pure and focused that it seemed to corrupt the very air around them. Here was malevolence given physical form, evil that existed for no purpose beyond the destruction of everything good and beautiful in the world. The beast's gaze swept the hall, taking in the foreign soldiers who dared to occupy his chosen hunting ground, and his lips drew back in a snarl that revealed teeth like daggers. The terror's first victim was one of the Geatish thanes who had not awakened quickly enough to escape the initial assault. Razor claws tore through flesh and bone as if they were soft clay, while crushing jaws destroyed the fighter's skull with a sound like breaking pottery. The speed and brutality of the attack left no doubt about the fate that awaited anyone who fell within the demon's reach. Yet even as his companion died horribly beside him, Ecgtheow's son felt no fear. Only the cold certainty that this was the moment for which fate had shaped his entire life. Rising from his resting place with movements that seemed almost casual, the young defender stepped forward to meet the fiend that had terrorized a kingdom for 12 years. The monster's second assault met resistance, unlike anything the beast had encountered in all his years of unopposed slaughter. The Geatish leader's hands closed around the demon's arm with a grip that seemed to surprise the terror as much as it pained him. For the first time since his war against mortal civilization had begun, the destroyer found himself matched against strength that rivaled his own. The battle that followed transcended ordinary combat to become something approaching cosmic struggle. Man and monster grappled in the vast space of Heorot, with force that shook the great hall's foundations and sent decorations crashing from the high rafters. Neither combatant could gain decisive advantage through strength alone, yet neither showed any sign of yielding to the other's assault. The fiend's mystical hide protected him from the crushing force of his opponent's grip, while the defender's extraordinary resilience allowed him to absorb punishment that would have killed any ordinary mortal. They crashed through benches and tables, scattered the carefully arranged shields and weapons of the sleeping area, and left deep gouges in the wooden floor where their feet sought purchase for greater leverage. As the struggle continued, the terror began to experience something unknown in his long existence: doubt. The strength that had made him invincible against all previous opponents was being matched by this young fighter, who seemed to draw power from some source beyond normal mortal capability. More disturbing still, his opponent's grip was growing stronger rather than weaker as the battle progressed, suggesting reserves of endurance that might well exceed his own. The decisive moment came when Ecgtheow's son managed to twist the beast's arm behind his back and apply pressure to the joint with the full force of his otherworldly strength. The demon's agonized howl echoed through Heorot like the cry of a damned soul, a sound of pain and rage and growing desperation that had never been heard from the monster's throat before. With a sound like the snapping of a great tree branch, the fiend's arm tore free from his shoulder, leaving the defender holding the terror's entire limb from fingertips to shoulder blade. The beast's shriek of anguish shattered the silence of the night and brought the entire court rushing from their sleeping quarters to witness the impossible sight of their tormentor fleeing in defeat. The destroyer's flight from Heorot marked the end of his reign of terror and the beginning of his journey toward death. The wounded fiend stumbled across the moors toward his lair in the dark fenlands, leaving a trail of blood that gleamed black in the moonlight. Behind him, the great mead house erupted in celebration as the Danes realized that their 12-year nightmare had finally ended. Ecgtheow's son stood in the center of the hall, holding aloft the severed arm as proof of victory. The trophy represented more than a defeated enemy. It symbolized the triumph of heroic virtue over mystical evil, of civilization over chaos, of hope over despair. The young champion had accomplished what an entire kingdom had been unable to achieve, and his name would echo through the ages as the defender who saved Denmark from the darkness. Dawn broke over Heorot like a golden blessing, illuminating scenes of jubilation that the great mead house had not witnessed for 12 long years. The severed arm of the terror hung from the high rafters, like a banner of victory, its massive claws gleaming in the morning light as proof that the impossible had been accomplished. Throughout Denmark, word spread with the speed of wildfire. The monster was dead, the nightmare had ended, and a foreign hero had achieved what no force in the realm had been able to accomplish. King Hrothgar wept openly as he examined the gruesome trophy, his tears flowing not from sorrow, but from overwhelming relief and gratitude. The grey-bearded sovereign had lived to see his domain freed from the shadow that had consumed an entire generation of his finest thanes. The ring-giver's joy knew no bounds, as he proclaimed the young Geat the greatest of all living fighters, a man destined to be remembered alongside the legendary heroes of ancient times. The celebration that followed surpassed even the magnificent feasts that had marked Heorot's original inauguration. Treasure flowed like water as Hrothgar showered the Geatish defenders with rewards befitting their extraordinary service. Golden arm rings, jeweled weapons, precious horses, and rare fabrics changed hands in a display of royal generosity that would be remembered for generations. The king formally adopted the victor as his son in spirit, creating bonds of kinship that would unite the royal houses of Denmark and Geatland for years to come. Bards throughout the land composed new songs celebrating the victory, their voices carrying the tale to every corner of the territory. The story grew in the telling, as such stories always do, but the essential truth remained unchanged. A single fighter had defeated an enemy that had brought an entire nation to its knees. Children who had known only fear of the darkness now danced in the streets, while their parents offered prayers of thanksgiving to the Almighty who had sent deliverance in their darkest hour. Yet even as the Danes celebrated their liberation, a darker intelligence brooded in the depths of the cursed mere, where the defeated monster had crawled to die. The ancient she-wolf who had given birth to that terror possessed a malevolence that burned even fiercer than her offspring's hatred. For countless years, she had dwelt in the otherworldly realm beneath the dark waters, nursing grievances older than the memory of men and plotting vengeance against the world that had cast her line into exile. The death of her son awakened in this primal fury, a rage that transcended all natural bounds. She had spawned the destroyer not from love, but from the pure malice that defined her existence. Yet the bonds between them ran deeper than mortal understanding. His destruction represented not merely the loss of offspring, but the defeat of everything she embodied. Chaos triumphant over order, darkness victorious over light, the ancient powers reclaiming dominion from the upstart civilizations of men. As night fell over the celebrating realm, this ancient evil rose from her underwater lair, with murder burning in her heart. Unlike her offspring, who had been driven by mindless hunger for destruction, she moved with calculated purpose. The she-demon understood exactly who had robbed her of her child, and exactly how to inflict the deepest possible wound upon those who dared to celebrate her loss. The terror's mother possessed all the mystical strength and weapon immunity that had made her son invincible, but her intelligence far exceeded his crude malevolence. She had observed the patterns of mortal civilization for countless generations, learning to recognize what they valued most highly: the bonds of loyalty between lord and retainer, the wisdom of aged counselors, the carefully maintained relationships that held nations together. These represented the targets where her vengeance could achieve maximum devastation. Her assault upon Heorot came without warning, in the darkest hours before dawn, when the exhausted celebrants had finally succumbed to sleep after their night of triumph. The she-fiend moved through the great hall like a shadow of death itself, seeking not random slaughter, but a specific victim whose loss would cut deepest into Hrothgar's heart. Her preternatural senses guided her unerringly to the sleeping form of Aesir, the king's most trusted advisor and dearest friend. This grizzled veteran had served the throne for decades, his wisdom helping to guide the country through countless crises. More than a mere counselor, Aesir had become Hrothgar's closest companion, the one man whose counsel the king valued above all others. His steady presence had provided stability during the darkest years of the monster's terror, and his friendship had sustained the royal spirit when despair threatened to overwhelm even the strongest will. The ancient fury killed the aged thane with swift efficiency, but her true purpose went beyond mere murder. She reclaimed her son's severed arm from its place of honor among the rafters, denying the Danes their trophy while recovering the physical remains of her offspring. Most significantly, she left clear signs that this attack represented calculated revenge, rather than random violence, a message that the war between her line and mortal civilization had entered a new and more terrible phase. When dawn revealed the magnitude of the catastrophe, the brief joy of victory transformed into bitter anguish. King Hrothgar's grief at the loss of his dearest friend exceeded even the despair that had consumed him during the years of his son's depredations. The realization that their celebration had been premature, that an even more dangerous enemy remained to threaten the land, crushed the spirits of those who had dared to hope that their suffering had finally ended. The king's summons to Beowulf carried the weight of absolute desperation. Hrothgar had staked everything on the young warrior's ability to free his people from unearthly terror, only to discover that victory had merely drawn forth an opponent whose malevolence exceeded even that of the original destroyer. The sovereign's plea for renewed assistance revealed both his complete dependence upon foreign aid and his growing fear that this new enemy might prove beyond even the Geatish defender's extraordinary capabilities. The description of the mere where this ancient evil dwelt painted a picture of unholy horror that challenged the boundaries of mortal understanding. Located in the most desolate region of Denmark, where no healthy thing could grow and even the bravest hunters feared to venture, the cursed lake existed as a wound in the natural world itself. Its dark waters reflected no light, supported no life, and radiated the kind of malevolent energy that poisoned everything within miles of its shores. Strange phenomena surrounded the hellish pool that defied rational explanation. Flames danced upon its surface without consuming anything, while unnatural sounds echoed from its depths during the darkest hours of night. Wolves and other predators, normally the masters of the wilderness, fled from the area as if driven by instinctive terror. Even the hardy trees that might have grown along its banks withered and died, leaving only blackened stumps as testimony to the evil that corrupted the very earth. The journey to this accursed place would test courage in ways that conventional battle never could. While mortal enemies might be faced with weapons and tactics, the spectral forces guarding the mere operated according to laws that human understanding could not fully grasp. Those who approached the dark waters reported experiencing overwhelming dread that seemed to emanate from the lake itself, as if the accumulated malice of centuries had somehow taken physical form. The hero accepted this new challenge with the same calm determination that had marked his approach to the original destroyer. The young fighter understood that his victory over the sun had been incomplete as long as the mother remained to threaten the realm. Moreover, the bonds of friendship and obligation that now tied him to Hrothgar demanded that he see the task through to its conclusion, regardless of the personal cost. The selection of companions for this expedition required even more careful consideration than had the original voyage from Geatland. The otherworldly nature of their destination meant that conventional fighting skills might prove less valuable than qualities of character and spirit. Those chosen to accompany their leader into the depths included not only the bravest fighters, but also men whose loyalty and moral strength might help them resist the corrupting influence of the evil they would face. The trek across the desolate moorlands toward the cursed mere tested both physical endurance and psychological resilience. The landscape itself seemed hostile to human presence, with twisted paths that led nowhere, sudden fogs that obscured familiar landmarks, and an oppressive atmosphere that drained the strength from even the hardiest travelers. Strange sounds echoed across the barren wastes, howls that came from no earthly throat, whispers in languages that predated human speech, and a constant low moaning that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. As the party approached their destination, signs of the mere's unholy nature became increasingly evident. The normal sounds of wildlife gradually faded until only an unnatural silence surrounded them, broken occasionally by inexplicable noises from the direction of the accursed waters. The air itself seemed to thicken with malevolent presence, while shadows moved in ways that defied the position of the sun overhead. The first sight of the mere itself struck the bravest hearts with instinctive dread. The dark water stretched before them like a wound in the earth, its surface smooth as black glass, yet somehow suggesting depths that extended far beyond the merely physical. No reflection appeared upon its surface, no ripples disturbed its stillness, and no signs of life could be detected in or around its shores. Most disturbing of all, the water seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a pool of absolute darkness that hurt the eyes to contemplate. Evidence of the she-demon's presence lay scattered around the mere's perimeter, like grisly warnings to those who might dare to approach. Bones of various creatures, both animal and human, gleamed white against the dark soil, while strange symbols carved into nearby rocks spoke of rituals too ancient and terrible for mortal comprehension. The very air carried scents that seemed to bypass the nose and strike directly at the primitive fears buried deep in human consciousness. The defender stood at the water's edge and contemplated the magnitude of the challenge before him. Unlike his battle with the terror, which had been fought in the familiar environment of the Great Hall, this confrontation would take place in the enemy's chosen domain. The mystical forces that protected the she-demon in her underwater lair might well exceed anything he had previously encountered, while the alien environment itself posed dangers that no amount of training could fully prepare him to face. The young warrior's decision to descend into the mere alone reflected both tactical necessity and heroic principle. His companions could provide little assistance in an underwater battle against a preternatural opponent, while their presence might actually hinder his movements in the confined spaces of the submerged lair. More importantly, the obligation to face such challenges personally was part of the burden that extraordinary strength placed upon those who possessed it. The ritual preparation for this descent into the otherworldly realm included both practical and spiritual elements. Weapons blessed by priests might provide some protection against unholy influences, while prayers and sacred symbols could offer additional defense against the corrupting power of absolute evil. Yet ultimately, success would depend upon the same qualities that had enabled victory over the destroyer: extraordinary strength guided by moral purpose and sustained by unshakable courage. As the Geat prepared to enter the cursed waters, his companions arranged themselves around the mere's perimeter to maintain vigil until his return. Each man understood that they might be witnessing the last moments of their leader's life, for no mortal had ever descended into those depths and returned to tell of what lay beneath. Yet each also recognized that this battle represented the only hope for truly ending the unearthly threat that had plagued Denmark for so many years. The young fighter's final words to his followers revealed both his acceptance of possible death and his determination to see the task completed regardless of personal cost. He spoke of the duty that bound him to Hrothgar, of the obligation that extraordinary gifts placed upon those who possessed them, and of the necessity of facing evil wherever it might be found. His calm acceptance of whatever fate awaited him in the depths reflected the kind of heroic resolve that would ensure his name lived on, even if his body did not. The moment of entry into the mere marked the beginning of a journey into realms beyond normal human experience. As the dark waters closed over the hero's head, he passed from the world of mortal conflict into a domain where different laws governed existence and where the very nature of reality itself bent to accommodate forces that predated civilization. The battle that awaited him in those spectral depths would test not only his physical strength, but also his spiritual resolve in ways that no earthly combat could ever duplicate. Somewhere in the lightless depths below, an ancient evil waited with patience born of countless centuries, and malice refined by generations of hatred. The she-demon had used the time since her son's death to prepare for this confrontation, gathering her mystical powers and arranging her defenses in the underwater realm that had served as her stronghold since time immemorial. The coming battle would determine not only the fate of Denmark, but also the eternal struggle between the forces of civilization and the primal chaos that forever sought to reclaim dominion over the world of men. The dark waters of the mere closed over the champion, like the mouth of death itself. Yet the Geat descended with the calm resolve of one who had already accepted whatever fate the depths might hold. The crushing weight of the cursed lake pressed against him from all sides, while the absolute darkness that surrounded him seemed to swallow not only light, but hope itself. No mortal had ever ventured into this otherworldly realm and returned to tell of what lay beneath, yet the defender pushed deeper into the abyss with unwavering determination. The descent seemed to last for hours, though time itself appeared to follow different laws in this preternatural domain. Strange currents pulled at his limbs with malevolent intent, while whispers in languages older than human civilization echoed through the crushing depths. The water itself felt wrong against his skin, too thick, too cold, carrying within it the accumulated malice of centuries. Yet his extraordinary strength sustained him, where any ordinary mortal would have drowned within moments of entering the accursed pool. At last, the warrior's feet touched solid ground in a vast underwater cavern that defied all natural explanation. Air filled this impossible space beneath the mere, though whether through ancient magic or divine intervention, no mortal mind could comprehend. Phosphorescent fungi clung to the walls, casting an eerie glow that revealed the true magnitude of the she-demon's lair. Here was a palace of sorts, built from the bones of countless victims, and decorated with treasures stolen from the surface world over millennia of predation. The ancient fury awaited him in the center of this hellish hall, her form even more terrible than her son's had been. Where Grendel had possessed brutal strength tempered by bestial cunning, his mother embodied pure malevolence refined by centuries of patient hatred. Her eyes burned with intelligence that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, while her claws gleamed with the blood of champions who had dared to challenge her dominion over the dark places of the world. The battle that erupted in that underwater realm transcended mortal combat to become something approaching cosmic warfare. The she-demon's strength matched her son's mystical power, yet her cunning far exceeded his crude malevolence. She fought with weapons forged in the depths of the earth, blades that could cut through steel as easily as flesh. Yet even these proved insufficient against the defender's extraordinary resilience and divinely blessed armor. For what seemed like hours, neither combatant could gain decisive advantage. The Geatish fighter's sword, which had served him faithfully through countless battles, shattered against the creature's unearthly hide like brittle glass. His strength, which had proved sufficient to tear the arm from her son, met resistance that seemed to draw power from the very foundations of the earth. The ancient evil fought not only with physical weapons, but with the accumulated darkness of ages, wielding despair itself as a weapon against mortal hope. Yet in the darkest moment of the struggle, when defeat seemed inevitable and death appeared certain, divine providence revealed the instrument of victory. Among the treasures hoarded in the creature's lair lay a sword of such extraordinary size and craftsmanship that no mortal smith could have forged it. This blade, wrought by giants in the dawn of the world, when the boundaries between earth and heaven were less firmly drawn, carried within its steel the power to harm beings that existed beyond normal physical laws. With strength born of desperation and guided by the hand of fate itself, the champion seized this ancient weapon and struck the killing blow. The giant's sword sliced through the she-demon's neck as easily as it might have cut through morning mist, sending her head rolling across the bone-strewn floor of her lair. The evil that had plagued the world for countless generations finally met its end in the depths where it had festered for so long. The moment of the creature's death sent shockwaves through the otherworldly realm that had sustained her existence. The blade that had delivered the fatal stroke began to dissolve like ice in a furnace, its metal consumed by the purifying fire that always follows the defeat of absolute evil. Only the golden hilt remained intact, a testament to the victory that had been achieved and proof of the divine intervention that had made such triumph possible. But the warrior's trials were not yet complete. Even as he searched the lair for additional trophies, he discovered the corpse of Grendel himself, the original destroyer whose reign of terror had brought such suffering to Denmark. With the same blade that had slain the mother, the victor severed the monster's head, ensuring that no trace of preternatural malevolence would remain to threaten future generations. The ascent from the depths proved as perilous as the original descent had been. Carrying the massive head of Grendel and the golden hilt of the giant's sword, the champion struggled against currents that seemed determined to drag him back into the abyss. Yet the same divine favor that had guided him to victory sustained him through this final trial, lifting him from the spectral realm back into the world of mortal men. His companions, who had maintained their vigil beside the cursed mere throughout the long hours of battle, erupted in joy at his return. Many had despaired of ever seeing their leader alive again, for the waters had boiled with mystical fury during the underwater combat, while unnatural sounds had echoed from the depths that suggested cosmic forces beyond mortal understanding. The sight of their commander emerging from the cursed waters with the head of the original destroyer proved that impossible victories could be achieved through courage, strength, and divine blessing. The return to Heorot became a triumphant procession that would be remembered for generations. 4 of the strongest Geatish warriors required their combined efforts to carry Grendel's massive head, while the victor himself bore the golden hilt that had survived the dissolution of the giant's blade. Word of the victory spread before them like wildfire, drawing crowds from every corner of the realm to witness the end of their otherworldly nightmare. Hrothgar's reaction to this second and final victory exceeded even his joy at the original destroyer's defeat. The wise sovereign recognized that the elimination of both monsters represented not merely the end of a particular threat, but the restoration of cosmic order itself. The forces of chaos that had challenged the foundations of civilization had been met and defeated by a champion whose extraordinary nature matched their own unearthly malevolence. The treasures bestowed upon the defender and his companions in recognition of this ultimate service surpassed even the legendary generosity of previous rewards. Golden arm rings, jeweled weapons, magnificent horses, and rare treasures from distant lands changed hands in a display of royal gratitude that established new standards for princely generosity. More significantly, the bonds forged between the Danish and Geatish royal houses through these shared trials would endure for generations, creating alliances that would shape the political landscape of the northern world. Yet even as he basked in the glory of victory and the gratitude of a liberated people, the champion understood that his destiny lay not in Denmark, but in his own homeland, across the Whale Road. The warrior's return to Geatland became itself a journey of triumph, as word of his extraordinary achievements preceded him to every port and coastal settlement. The promising fighter who had sailed from his homeland as an untested champion returned as the greatest defender of his age, a man whose name would echo through the centuries alongside the legendary figures of ancient times. Hygelac's reception of his nephew and most valued thane reflected both personal pride and political wisdom. The glory that the victor had won in Denmark enhanced the reputation of the entire Geatish royal house, while the treasures he brought back demonstrated the tangible benefits that could flow from supporting heroic enterprises. The sovereign's court became a magnet for ambitious warriors, seeking to serve under a leader whose exploits had already become the stuff of legend. For many years, the champion served his uncle with the same loyalty and courage that had marked his service to Hrothgar. When Hygelac led military expeditions against neighboring peoples, the defender fought at his side with valor that inspired awe even among veterans accustomed to heroic deeds. His presence on any battlefield virtually guaranteed victory, while his counsel in matters of strategy and diplomacy proved as valuable as his strength in combat. Yet fate, which had smiled upon the warrior through his early triumphs, reserved for him trials that would test different aspects of his character. During a raid against the Hetware, a powerful confederation of tribes dwelling along the Rhine, Hygelac fell in battle despite the desperate efforts of his nephew to protect him. The death of his beloved uncle and ruler struck the champion with grief that exceeded even the sorrow he had felt at the loss of fallen comrades. For Hygelac had been more than a sovereign. He had been a father figure whose guidance had shaped the emerging leader's understanding of responsibility. The aftermath of this catastrophe presented the defender with choices that would define the remainder of his life. Queen Hygd, Hygelac's widow, offered him the throne itself. Recognizing that her sons lacked the strength and experience necessary to hold the kingdom together in such troubled times. The warrior's extraordinary prowess and proven wisdom made him the obvious choice to serve as regent until the royal heirs came of age, yet he declined this honor out of loyalty to his fallen ruler's bloodline. Instead, the champion chose to serve as guardian and advisor to Prince Herdred, Hygelac's son and rightful heir to the Geatish throne. This decision reflected the same moral principle that had guided his refusal to use weapons against Grendel. The understanding that true honor required fairness and respect for legitimate authority, even when personal advantage might be gained through different choices. The years that followed tested the defender's wisdom and political skills as thoroughly as his earlier adventures had tested his physical courage. Protecting an inexperienced monarch from internal rivals and external enemies required constant vigilance, diplomatic finesse, and the careful application of just enough force to maintain stability without appearing to usurp royal authority. The champion's reputation alone deterred many potential challenges, while his counsel helped guide the realm through crises that might otherwise have torn it apart. Yet even the greatest champions cannot indefinitely postpone the workings of fate. During a conflict with the Swedish royal house, Prince Herdred fell in battle, despite his guardian's efforts to protect him. The ruler's death left the throne vacant and the kingdom vulnerable to conquest by its enemies, forcing the defender to accept the crown that he had twice refused when it was offered under less desperate circumstances. The transformation from warrior to monarch required the development of entirely new skills and perspectives. Where once he had been able to solve problems through individual action and personal courage, he now faced challenges that required patience, compromise, and the careful management of competing interests. The extraordinary strength that had made him invincible in combat proved less useful when dealing with problems of taxation, trade disputes, and the complex web of alliances that determined a small kingdom's survival in a hostile world. Yet the new sovereign proved as capable a ruler as he had been a fighter. His reign, which would eventually span 50 years, became synonymous with justice, prosperity, and the kind of wise leadership that transforms kingdoms into legends. The treasure he had won in his heroic youth was distributed generously to loyal followers, creating bonds of loyalty that held the realm together through numerous crises. His reputation for fairness in judgment drew disputants from distant lands seeking his arbitration, while his known prowess in battle deterred aggression from potential enemies. Under his rule, the Geatish realm experienced a golden age that recalled the prosperity Denmark had enjoyed under Hrothgar before the coming of preternatural terror. Trade flourished as merchants sought the protection of a domain ruled by the greatest champion of the age. Warriors flocked to serve in his war band, hoping to learn the secrets of leadership from one whose exploits had become legendary. Poets and bards gathered at his court to compose songs celebrating both his past achievements and his ongoing success as a ruler. The monarch's personal life reflected the same principles that guided his public service. He never married, dedicating himself entirely to the welfare of his people and the preservation of his kingdom's independence. This choice, while unusual for a sovereign whose bloodline might have secured the succession, demonstrated his understanding that leadership sometimes required personal sacrifice for the greater good. As the years passed and his hair grew grey, the aging ruler often reflected on the strange paths that fate had carved for his life. The emerging warrior who had sailed to Denmark seeking glory and adventure had become an aged sovereign whose greatest battles were fought in council chambers rather than on bloody fields. Yet he never regretted the choices that had brought him to this point, for each decision had been guided by the same principles of honor, loyalty, and service that had sustained him through his darkest trials. The wisdom that comes with age and experience taught him to see patterns in the rise and fall of kingdoms that his earlier self could never have recognized. He understood that even the greatest champions were mortal, that all earthly glory faded like frost before the morning sun, and that the true measure of a life lay not in the treasures accumulated or the enemies defeated, but in the legacy left for future generations. Yet even as he contemplated the twilight of his reign and the approaching shadows of mortality, fate was preparing one final test that would challenge everything he had learned about leadership, sacrifice, and the price of heroic glory. In the depths of an ancient barrow, where gold and jewels had lain undisturbed for countless generations, something stirred that would bring the aged monarch face to face with the same kind of unearthly terror that had first made his name famous in the halls of distant Denmark. The greatest champions, it seemed, were destined to face their ultimate trials, not in the strength of youth, but in the wisdom of age, when the stakes were highest and the cost of failure extended far beyond personal doom to encompass the fate of all those who depended upon their protection and leadership. For 50 years, The aged monarch had ruled his people with wisdom and strength, bringing unprecedented prosperity to the Geatish realm. Trade flourished under his protection, alliances secured the borders, and the treasury overflowed with tribute from grateful allies. Yet fate, which had blessed the sovereign with extraordinary longevity and success, was preparing to demand a final accounting that would test everything he had learned about leadership, sacrifice, and the true cost of heroic glory. The catalyst for this ultimate trial came from the depths of an ancient burial mound that had stood undisturbed since the dawn of time. Within this barrow lay treasures beyond counting: golden cups and jeweled weapons, precious ornaments and rare artifacts accumulated by some forgotten dynasty whose very name had vanished from human memory. For centuries, this hoard had slumbered in darkness, protected by forces that discouraged mortal interference and kept the curious at bay through subtle but persistent dread. Yet greed, that most persistent of human failings, eventually found a way to breach these mystical defenses. A desperate slave, fleeing the wrath of his master after some offense now lost to history, stumbled upon the entrance to the barrow while seeking refuge in the wilderness. Driven by hunger and the reckless courage of desperation, the fugitive crept into the tomb and seized a single golden cup from among the countless treasures, hoping to purchase forgiveness or freedom with this magnificent prize. This theft, though seemingly insignificant given the vast wealth that remained untouched, violated ancient compacts that had maintained the balance between the world of men and the realm of supernatural forces. The cup had not been merely stored in the barrow, but actively guarded by a creature of such age and power that its very existence predated human civilization. This worm, last of its kind and keeper of accumulated wealth beyond mortal comprehension, had slept for generations in the depths of the mound, its dreams filled with memories of treasure and the solemn duty to protect what had been entrusted to its care. The awakening of this primordial force sent tremors through the fabric of reality itself. The beast's fury at discovering the violation of its hoard burned with the intensity of molten gold, while its rage at being roused from centuries of peaceful slumber transformed quickly into an implacable determination to punish not only the thief, but all who shared his mortal nature. This was no mere creature driven by animal instinct, but an ancient intelligence that understood the symbolic significance of its role as guardian of treasures and keeper of the boundary between earthly ambition and divine justice. The fire-breathing monster's initial response to the theft demonstrated both its supernatural power and its terrible intelligence. Rather than simply pursuing the individual thief, the terror chose to make war upon human civilization itself, targeting the settlements and strongholds that represented everything mortals had built during the long years of peace. Night after night, the beast emerged from its violated lair to spread fire and destruction across the Geatish countryside, reducing prosperous farms to ash and driving terrified populations from their ancestral homes. The attacks followed no pattern that military minds could anticipate or counter. The serpent struck from the skies with the swiftness of lightning, breathing flames that could melt stone and reduce timber halls to glowing embers within moments. No earthly weapon could reach the creature during these aerial assaults, while its armored hide appeared impervious to any damage that human weapons might inflict. Entire villages vanished in single nights, leaving only blackened foundations and the twisted remains of what had once been thriving communities. Most devastating of all, the winged destroyer's assault reached even the royal stronghold itself, reducing portions of the palace to ruins and threatening the very symbol of Geatish sovereignty. This attack carried particular significance beyond mere destruction, for it demonstrated that no mortal power, regardless of its earthly strength, could stand against the unleashed fury of forces that belonged to an older and more terrible order of existence. The aged ruler's response to this catastrophe revealed both the accumulated wisdom of his long reign and the unchanging core of heroic valor that had defined his entire life. While his advisors counseled seeking aid from neighboring kingdoms or attempting to appease the ancient terror through offerings of tribute, the sovereign recognized that this challenge demanded the same kind of personal courage that had made his name legendary in distant Denmark half a century earlier. Yet the monarch was no longer the vibrant champion who had torn the arm from Grendel or descended into cursed waters to battle supernatural evil. 50 years of kingship had brought wisdom and perspective that his earlier self had lacked, but they had also brought the inevitable weakening of mortal flesh that no amount of heroic will could entirely overcome. His hair had whitened, his joints ached with the accumulated strain of countless battles, and his strength, though still extraordinary by normal standards, had diminished from the peak that had once made him invincible. The decision to face the Guardian personally reflected not reckless bravado, but cold calculation of the available options. No other warrior in the kingdom possessed even a fraction of the supernatural strength that such a battle would require, while the creature's proven ability to devastate the realm from the air meant that conventional military strategies offered no hope of success. If the Geatish people were to survive this trial, their salvation would depend upon the same kind of individual heroism that had saved Denmark from the terror of Grendel's line. The aging sovereign's preparations for this final battle combined practical military planning with the kind of spiritual preparation appropriate for one who understood that death was not merely possible, but likely. He commissioned the finest smiths in the kingdom to forge a shield of iron rather than wood, reasoning that only metal could provide protection against the worm's flame. His weapons were blessed by priests and sharpened to edges that could cut through mail, while his armor was reinforced with additional plates that might deflect claws capable of rending stone. More significantly, the ruler composed what amounted to his final testament, distributing his personal treasures among loyal followers and making provisions for the kingdom's governance after his anticipated death. These preparations revealed his clear understanding that this battle represented not merely another heroic challenge, but the culmination of a life spent in service to ideals that transcended personal survival. The selection of companions for this ultimate adventure proved more difficult than any previous expedition. The beast's supernatural nature meant that conventional military support would likely prove useless, while the extreme danger involved made it difficult to justify asking any follower to share in what might well prove a futile sacrifice. Yet the bonds of loyalty that had sustained the kingdom through 50 years of prosperity could not be easily set aside, and several of the monarch's most trusted thanes insisted upon their right to accompany their lord into this final trial. Among these volunteers, one stood out for both his courage and his close kinship to the royal house. Wiglaf, son of Weohstan, had proven himself in numerous battles and demonstrated the kind of unwavering loyalty that marked the finest of warriors. His presence on this expedition would provide not only practical assistance, but also symbolic continuity, representing the next generation of leadership that would need to guide the kingdom through whatever trials awaited beyond the current crisis. The journey to the ancient terror's barrow became a solemn procession that drew the attention of the entire realm. Common folk lined the route to witness what they understood might be their final glimpse of the sovereign who had protected them for so many years, while nobles and warriors offered prayers to whatever gods might still listen to the pleas of mortal men. The very air seemed heavy with the weight of destiny, as if the world itself recognized that great events were approaching that would reshape the future of all who lived within its boundaries. The ancient burial mound rose from the landscape like a man-made mountain, its earthen sides carved with symbols that predated written history and radiated an aura of power that made even the bravest hearts quail. Smoke emerged from fissures in its slopes, while the sound of movement within its depths suggested the presence of something vast and terrible, stirring in anticipation of battle. The very ground around the barrow had been scorched black by the serpent's flames, creating a wasteland where no living thing could survive. As the royal party approached this desolate stronghold, the aged monarch called his followers together for what he understood would be his final speech as their living lord. His words revealed both the accumulated wisdom of his long reign and the undiminished courage that had sustained him through half a century of challenges. He spoke of the duties that bind rulers to their people, of the obligations that extraordinary strength places upon those who possess it, and of the necessity of facing evil regardless of personal cost. Most significantly, the sovereign acknowledged the likelihood of his own death in the coming battle, while expressing confidence that his sacrifice would serve a purpose greater than individual survival. He had lived longer than most heroes could expect, had achieved greater glory than any warrior of his generation, and had ruled with justice and wisdom through decades of prosperity. If fate now demanded payment for these blessings, he would meet that obligation with the same courage that had defined his entire life. The entrance to the creature's lair yawned before them, like the mouth of hell itself, its depths illuminated by the hellish glow of flames that never died, and heat that could melt armor at a distance. Strange sounds echoed from within, the scraping of massive claws against stone, the rush of air through caverns carved by supernatural force, and beneath it all, a low rumbling that might have been breathing, or might have been the very earth protesting against the evil it was forced to contain. The aged warrior's final preparations included the ritual donning of armor that had protected him through countless battles, the blessing of weapons that had never failed him in combat, and the offering of prayers to gods whose favor had sustained him through trials that would have destroyed lesser men. Yet beneath these familiar ceremonies lay the recognition that this confrontation would differ fundamentally from all previous challenges he had faced. As the monarch prepared to descend into the Guardian's domain, his followers arranged themselves around the barrow's entrance according to a plan that balanced their desire to assist their lord with the practical recognition that conventional weapons would likely prove useless against their supernatural enemy. Their primary role would be to bear witness to whatever transpired in the depths, and to carry word of their sovereign's final battle to those who would need to understand how their protector had met his end. The moment of entry into the ancient mound marked the beginning of a confrontation that would determine not only the fate of the Jetish kingdom, but also the eternal reputation of its greatest ruler. Somewhere in the flame-lit depths below, a creature of unimaginable age and power waited with the patience of centuries and the fury of violated trust. The battle that was about to commence would test every virtue the aging hero had developed over his long life, while the outcome would echo through the ages as either the triumphant conclusion of an exemplary reign or the tragic end of an era when individual courage could still triumph over the forces of chaos and destruction. The greatest test of a hero's life, it seemed, came not in youth when strength was at its peak and glory seemed easily won, but in age when wisdom had replaced vigor and the stakes involved the welfare of all those who depended upon heroic protection. The aged monarch understood this truth as he advanced into the winged destroyer's domain, carrying with him the hopes of his people and the accumulated legacy of a lifetime spent in service to ideals that transcended personal ambition or fear of death. The descent into the ancient barrow led the aged monarch through passages carved from living rock, their walls blackened by centuries of flame, and decorated with the accumulated bones of those who had dared to challenge the Guardian's dominion. The very air burned with heat that would have killed lesser men, while the oppressive weight of otherworldly malevolence pressed against his spirit like a physical force. Yet the sovereign advanced without hesitation, his iron shield raised against the growing intensity of fire that announced his approach to the creature's inner sanctum. The confrontation, when it came, erupted with the fury of elemental forces unleashed. The ancient worm, roused to full wakefulness by the intrusion into its most sacred domain, emerged from the hoard chamber like a living avalanche of scale and flame. Its massive form filled the cavern from floor to ceiling, while its eyes burned with intelligence and hatred accumulated over countless centuries. This was no mere beast driven by animal instinct, but a creature whose malevolence had been refined by eons of brooding solitude into something approaching pure evil. The battle that followed would be remembered as the greatest single combat in the history of the Northern world. The aged champion, drawing upon reserves of strength and courage that seemed to transcend mortal limitations, met the creature's assault with valor that recalled the legendary deeds of his youth. His iron shield, crafted specifically for this encounter, withstood the first terrible blast of flame that would have reduced any ordinary protection to molten slag. His ancient sword, blessed by priests and sharpened to perfection, bit deep into the beast's armored hide, drawing black blood that hissed and steamed upon the stone floor. Yet even as the monarch fought with skill and determination that honored his legendary reputation, the toll of age and the overwhelming power of his opponent began to tell. The serpent's claws, each one longer than a fighter's sword, raked across his armor with force that sent him staggering. Its flame, hot enough to melt stone, seared through gaps in his protection, bringing agony that would have broken the will of any ordinary man. Most devastating of all, his trusted blade, the weapon that had served him faithfully through countless battles, shattered against the creature's preternatural hide, leaving him virtually defenseless against an enemy whose power seemed to exceed all mortal comprehension. In this moment of supreme crisis, when defeat and mortality seemed inevitable, the true measure of loyalty that bound the greatest thanes to their leaders was revealed. While the other soldiers fled in terror from the barrow's entrance, overwhelmed by fear of the mystical forces they could neither understand nor effectively combat, one man chose honor over safety, duty over survival. Wiglaf, son of Weostan, descendant of the noble house of Wegmunding and kinsman to the royal line, drew his sword and plunged into the flame-lit depths to stand beside his sovereign in the hour of greatest need. The young fighter's intervention proved decisive, though not in the way that conventional military thinking might have predicted. His blade, though wielded with courage and skill, could no more penetrate the beast's hide than his master's had done. Yet his presence served to distract the creature at the crucial moment, creating the opening that the aged ruler needed to deliver one final, desperate assault. With strength born of absolute determination and guided by the accumulated skill of a lifetime spent in combat, the monarch drove his broken sword deep into the serpent's vulnerable throat, piercing the one spot where its unearthly armor could not protect it. The victory came at a price that transformed triumph into tragedy. Even as the ancient terror breathed its last, its dying breath carried venom that no mortal frame could withstand. The poison coursed through the champion's veins like liquid fire, bringing with it the certain knowledge that his own end would follow swiftly upon his enemy's destruction. The greatest defender of his age, the man who had saved Denmark from otherworldly horror and ruled his own people with wisdom and justice for 50 years, would not survive to enjoy the fruits of his final victory. Yet in his last moments, the dying sovereign showed the same nobility of spirit that had defined his entire life. Rather than lamenting his fate or raging against the injustice of mortality, he spoke words of gratitude for the long life he had been granted and the opportunity to end his days in service to his people's welfare. He gazed upon the vast riches that his victory had won: golden cups and jeweled weapons, precious ornaments and rare artifacts accumulated over centuries, and saw in it not personal enrichment, but the means to secure his kingdom's future prosperity. The aged ruler's final instructions to Wiglaf revealed both his practical wisdom and his understanding of the symbolic importance of heroic sacrifice. The wealth must be distributed among the people, ensuring that the benefits of his final battle would extend to all who had depended upon his protection. A great mound must be built upon the headland overlooking the sea, visible to all who sailed those waters, serving as an eternal reminder of the champion who had given his life to preserve civilization from the forces of chaos and destruction. Most significantly, the dying monarch spoke of succession and the future governance of his realm. Though he had never married or fathered children, choosing instead to dedicate his entire life to his people's welfare, he recognized in Wiglaf the qualities necessary for leadership in the dark times that would surely follow his passing. The young defender's courage in the face of extraordinary terror, his loyalty to his leader even unto the grave, and his noble lineage all marked him as worthy to inherit the responsibilities that the aged ruler could no longer bear. As life ebbed from the great man's body, he spoke final words that would echo through the centuries, summarizing a philosophy of leadership and sacrifice that had guided him through triumph and trial alike. He had sought glory not for its own sake, but as the foundation upon which just rule could be built. He had accepted the burden of kingship not as a privilege to be enjoyed, but as a duty to be fulfilled regardless of personal cost. He had faced each challenge with the understanding that true nobility lay not in the accumulation of power, but in its proper use for the protection and prosperity of those who could not protect themselves. The silence that followed the monarch's demise seemed to encompass more than the mere absence of breath and heartbeat. An entire era had ended with his passing, the age when individual heroism could still triumph over mystical evil, when the bonds between leader and retainer provided sufficient strength to overcome any challenge, when the ancient values of courage, loyalty, and sacrifice retained their power to shape the destiny of nations. Wiglaf's grief at his sovereign's end mingled with rage at his fellow thanes, who had fled when their courage was most needed. The young swordsman's condemnation of their cowardice carried weight beyond personal reproach, for it highlighted the decay of the ideals that had once bound Germanic society together. When the bonds of loyalty weakened and self-preservation took precedence over duty, the very foundations of their civilization began to crumble like ancient masonry exposed to wind and weather. The retrieval of the champion's body from the depths of the barrow became itself a ritual of profound significance. The greatest defender of his age could not be left to lie forgotten in the darkness beside his defeated enemy, but must be brought into the light where his people could properly honor his sacrifice. The process required not only physical effort, but spiritual courage, for the preternatural forces that had protected the horde did not entirely dissipate with the Guardian's destruction. Word of the ruler's final victory and subsequent passing spread across the Geatish realm with the swiftness of wildfire, bringing both joy at the end of the terror and profound sorrow at the loss of their protector. The reactions revealed the complex emotions that great leaders inspire in those they serve: gratitude for past protection mingled with fear for an uncertain future, pride in their sovereign's heroic end balanced against anxiety about the challenges that would face his successor. The preparation of the funeral pyre became a communal effort, that drew participants from every corner of the realm. Fighters brought their finest weapons to burn alongside their fallen leader, while craftsmen contributed precious artifacts that demonstrated the prosperity his reign had brought. Common folk offered simpler gifts, flowers and herbs, carved ornaments and woven cloths, that showed their understanding that greatness was measured not only in gold and glory, but in the love and loyalty of those whose lives had been touched by heroic service. The construction of the pyre itself followed ancient traditions that connected the present ceremony to the legendary funerals of champions whose names had passed into myth. The wood was arranged in precise patterns that honored the gods of wind and flame, while the placement of grave goods reflected beliefs about the afterlife that predated the arrival of Christian teaching. Yet the ceremony also incorporated newer elements that acknowledged the religious changes that had swept across the northern world during the legend's long lifetime. As the flames consumed the mortal remains of their greatest monarch, the assembled mourners understood that they were witnessing more than the end of a single life. The Geatish realm, deprived of the extraordinary strength that had protected it for 50 years, faced an uncertain future in a world where neighboring powers would not hesitate to exploit any sign of weakness. The gold won from the ancient hoard would provide temporary prosperity, but it could not replace the personal charisma and martial prowess that had made their homeland respected throughout the northern world. A woman's voice rose above the crackling flames in a lament that gave expression to the deepest fears of all who witnessed the ceremony. Her prophetic song spoke of invasion and conquest, of the destruction of their way of life, of slavery and exile, for those who had once lived as free people under their champion's protection. The vision she painted was dark indeed, enemies pressing in from all sides. The royal hall reduced to ashes, the survivors scattered like leaves before an autumn storm. Yet even as the mourners contemplated these grim possibilities, they drew strength from the memory of their departed leader's example. He had faced every challenge with courage, had met every trial with honor, had sacrificed everything for the welfare of those he served. If his people could preserve even a portion of that spirit, if they could remember the lessons his life had taught about duty, loyalty, and sacrifice, then something of his legacy would endure even through the dark times that lay ahead. The construction of the memorial mound began immediately after the funeral fires had burned to ash. The great barrow rose from the headland like a man-made mountain, its earthen sides reinforced with stone, and its summit crowned with markers that would guide seafarers for generations to come. Within its depths lay not only the champion's ashes, but also a portion of the riches he had won in his final battle, ensuring that his generosity would continue even in the grave. The placement of this monument carried symbolic significance that extended far beyond mere commemoration. Standing on the highest point of the coastline, visible to all who approached by sea, it served as both a beacon and a warning. Travelers would know that this land had once been protected by a defender whose strength transcended mortal limitations, while potential enemies would be reminded that such greatness, once achieved, left echoes that could inspire future generations to comparable deeds. As the work of construction proceeded, bards began the process of transforming recent events into the kind of song stories that would preserve the legend's memory for ages to come. The tale they crafted balanced historical truth with poetic enhancement, creating a narrative that captured not only the facts of what had occurred, but also the deeper meanings that gave those facts their lasting significance. Their verses would carry the story far beyond the borders of the Geatish realm, ensuring that the name and deeds of their greatest ruler would be remembered in distant lands and future times. The completion of the memorial mound marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The age of champions was passing, giving way to a time when survival would depend more upon political alliances and economic resources than upon individual courage and unearthly strength. Yet the example set by the departed sovereign continued to inspire those who remembered his deeds, providing a standard of excellence that could guide future leaders even when the specific challenges they faced differed from those their predecessor had overcome. 10 days after the funeral pyre had burned to embers, the Geatish nobles gathered to choose their new leader and to chart a course for their people's future. The selection of Wiglaf as their monarch surprised no one who had witnessed his courage in the final battle. Yet all understood that the young ruler faced challenges that would test different qualities than those that had made his predecessor legendary. Where once extraordinary strength had been sufficient to overcome any threat, now diplomatic skill and strategic thinking would prove equally important for survival. In his first address to the assembled nobles and thanes, the new sovereign acknowledged both the magnitude of his inheritance and the impossibility of replacing the irreplaceable. He spoke of his determination to preserve what could be preserved of their traditional way of life, while adapting to changed circumstances that demanded new approaches to old problems. His words revealed understanding that true loyalty to his predecessor's memory lay not in futile attempts to duplicate past glories, but in applying the principles that had guided those achievements to the different challenges of a new age. The final assessment of their departed champion's legacy would be left to future generations. Yet those who had known him personally could already recognize the permanent changes his life had brought to their world. He had demonstrated that individual courage could still triumph over seemingly impossible odds, that loyalty and sacrifice retained their power to transform dire circumstances into glorious victories, and that true nobility consisted not in the accumulation of wealth and power, but in their proper use for the protection of those who could not protect themselves. The story of his life would be told and retold for as long as human voices could carry song across the northern seas. Mothers would teach their children his name as a synonym for courage and honor, while fighters would invoke his example when facing their own trials and tribulations. Rulers would measure their own achievements against the standard he had set, while poets would find in his deeds the raw material for verses that could inspire heroic behavior in generations yet unborn. Most significantly, his passing marked the end of an age when otherworldly threats required extraordinary responses, when individual champions could single-handedly determine the fate of entire peoples, when the ancient values of personal courage and loyalty provided sufficient foundation for stable governance. The world that emerged from the ashes of his funeral pyre would be more complex, more political, more dependent upon collective action rather than individual achievement. Yet the memory of what one man had accomplished through strength of arm and nobility of spirit would endure as proof that heroic ideals, properly understood and courageously applied, could transcend the limitations of any single era. In the words that would conclude the great song of his life and deeds, the bards would speak truly when they called him the mildest of men and the most beloved of rulers, the most gracious to his people and the most eager for fame. For he had shown that true greatness lay not in power over others, but in service to them, not in the accumulation of riches, but in their generous distribution, not in the avoidance of danger, but in the willing acceptance of whatever risks duty demanded. The wind from the sea carried his name across the waters, to distant shores where other peoples faced their own struggles against the forces of chaos and destruction. In times of crisis, when darkness seemed to triumph over light and evil appeared stronger than good, those who remembered his story would find in it the inspiration needed to continue fighting, to maintain hope, to believe that courage and honor could still make a difference in a world that often seemed indifferent to such values. Thus ended the life, and began the legend of the greatest champion the northern world had ever known, a man whose deeds would echo through the ages as testimony to the enduring power of human nobility in the face of overwhelming odds.